Good afternoon, everybody. I'm George Vincent. I'm a member of the Political Science Advisory Board, and it's my great honor to introduce our first panel today. Before I get started, I want to introduce our moderator. First, it's Alan Stamm, Professor of Political Science here at the University of Michigan. He's a member of the Executive Committee and Centennial Committee, so if you like the program, he gets the thanks. If you didn't, it's Chuck Shippen's responsibility. His research focuses on the dynamics of armed conflict between and within states, and he's teaching a class that my daughter is in this year, so show her some slack, Alan. Appreciate the help. Our panel is wide-ranging today. We've got 5 great people, all Michigan grads, with a wide range of experience, but all focusing on world affairs. Our first panelist, Deborah Yarsik-Ball, holds 2 degrees from Michigan.
You got my maiden name correct.
I got the maiden name correct. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chuck, for helping me with that. She's an associate program leader in the Counterproliferation and Operational Intelligence Support Program at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. She also heads the Dynamic Network Assessment Group, which seeks to discover and characterize networks of state and non-state actors intent on creating and using weapons of mass destruction. Annalisa Liebold, our most recent graduate, for 2008, was the honor recipient of the Harold D. Osterwile Prize in Economics and the William Jennings Bryant Leadership Prize in Political Science. She is currently completing her final year at the Yale Law School's JD program and has recently published a study of the Chad-Cameroon oil pipeline, focusing on the World Bank's role in resource exploitation in underdeveloped states. Ambassador Melvin Levitsky, you can wave, is our most senior member of our panel. He's a bit like the Energizer Bunny. He just keeps going in ways that always work to contribute to a better society. He is Professor of International Policy and Practice at the Ford School. He served as ambassador to Brazil from 1994 to 1998. He also held such senior positions as Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics Matters, Executive Secretary of the State Department, Ambassador to Bulgaria, Deputy Director of the Voice of America, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, Director of the Office of U.S.-Soviet Bilateral Affairs, and Director of UN Political Affairs, all before he was 20. No one's listening. Our fourth panelist is Lena Pollack, an active politician who served 3 terms in the Michigan Senate and spent 12 years as president of the Michigan Environmental Council. Now is the United States Section Chair of the International Joint Commission, which helps prevent and resolve disputes and advises the Canadian and U.S. governments on their shared boundary waters. Finally, David Schuster, 1989 graduate, is an Emmy Award-winning broadcast news anchor and reporter. He's covered Operation Iraqi Freedom, the first elections in Baghdad, the selection of Pope Benedict, and Hurricane Katrina. We're delighted to have these 5 here with us and to have Professor Stamm to moderate our panel. Take it away, panelists.
Thank you very much. I think we'll just go in sequence of introduction, and we'll begin with Debbie.
Maybe jump up there.
Okay. Hi, thank you for coming out. For me, the underlying motivation for getting a political science degree was this strong desire I had to advance national security interests of the United States in some way. Today we're invited to discuss how our political science concentration helped advance our careers or helped us with our careers. And we've got to do this in 6 minutes. So at some point I might even pick up my speed faster than I am right now. I sat down to think about this issue and quickly came up with 5 ways in which my political science degrees, and I do have both an undergrad and graduate degree here, which I think was mentioned, how that helped me. And I'm sure I could come up with a lot more, but that'll be when I have 10 minutes to give a talk. So let me briefly give you some context for how my degree helped me. I'll talk briefly about where I work and what I do, and then get into some of the ways in which my degree helped me. I work, as already mentioned, at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and if you're not familiar with it, Livermore is one of the nation's 2 nuclear weapons design labs, the first, of course, being Los Alamos, where the atomic bomb was developed. There's about 6,700 employees, and 1,600 of them are all scientists and engineers, most with PhDs. World-class science is conducted there. We not only have some of the greatest nuclear physicists, but we have biologists, chemists, engineers, and of course we have some of the world's very fastest computers. So our high-performance computing capability is practically unmatched. Among all these people, there are 28 political scientists at the lab, and some of them are up in senior management, so they're not actually doing research. In my own division, 3 of them are from the University of Michigan, all got PhDs here. So we sing the Go Blue song quite frequently. What do the political scientists do in general? We work together with the scientists who have knowledge of nuclear, chemical, biological weapons, and we use that to try and understand what other countries' capabilities are, and as well as what terrorists might be up to. What do I do personally in that context? I was originally hired at the lab actually as a Soviet military specialist, having written my dissertation with Bill Zimmerman on the Soviet military. By the time I arrived after being hired, I was a Russian military specialist. I worked at the lab for years on non-proliferation issues, and particularly those that pertain to Russia. And today, I do a number of things, and my responsibilities vary from being a manager responsible for internal operations for 53 full-time employees, to being, as mentioned, a group leader of the Dynamic Network Assessment Group, where we do try to characterize and understand state and non-state actors who are intent on acquiring WMD. One way we go about this is we do research, we cull all the information out there, we develop large data sets about knowledge, organizations, people, tasks, a lot of other key variables, and we apply mathematical tools to identify key nodes in very large networks. The warfighter for this kind of work is our main customer. I'm also a PI on various projects. I'm doing a project right now for the Department of State that took me to Iraq in February for 3 weeks. I'm a PI on a Black Sea architecture project for the Department of Homeland Security, which is aimed at preventing nuclear smuggling through that region. Who do I work this for? Who do I do this work for in addition to whom I've mentioned? We support all the geographic combatant commands. I support some of the functional combatant commands, including STRATCOM and SOCOM, Special Operations Command. We support DOD, DOE, DHS, the intel community. Now, the good stuff, why Bill actually invited me here. So how does all this, how did being here, being a political scientist, how did that help me in my work, and how does it help me in my work today? First, I'd like to say that it's not just a political science degree. It truly is a University of Michigan political science degree. So if I was invited to give this talk elsewhere, I'm not sure I could. We learned how to conduct research here using the scientific method. There's just no way you can leave here without it becoming part of your DNA. All my thinking is in terms of causal variables, and let me tell you, it's very helpful when you have children that you're trying to raise. You leave here, you just operationalize terms automatically. You think about evidence, spurious relationships. And a lot of the stuff we do is important. The warfighter acts on a lot of the information. So you think about rejecting the null hypothesis. You think about competing hypotheses. You think about the inductive-deductive approach all the time. By way of example, I worked for a long time, and still of concern is concern over smuggling of either nuclear material or nuclear weapons from Russia. There's a lot of that there. A number of people have said organized crime would be the perfect organization to smuggle material or weapons out. They've got established trafficking routes, they know how to do business, and then others say no, they wouldn't do it because it's bad for business. So that's a hypothesis. And so what evidence do you look for? What kind of information to prove that hypothesis? The other way, using an inductive approach, a piece of intel information might come in. What does it mean? What does it mean? What is it an indicator of? What other kind of indicators would we have to see to create this picture and develop a hypothesis? And what would refute that hypothesis that we've developed? The second thing is mentoring. This is not only a great research department, but the profs here, the professors play an incredibly important mentoring role. I have had the pleasure of being at a number of other teaching institutions, research institutions in the United States, and I can say without a doubt here that the professors are very interested in the development of the students. They care more about the students than getting an op-ed piece published in the next New York Times issue. A corollary to that, so 3, or what might be 2B, is while there's a healthy appreciation here for academe, the professors here are not so arrogant as that they would not encourage students to pursue another occupation. They encourage you to pursue your passion. And I know one of my colleagues who was also a student of Bill Zimmerman's was toying with the idea of, did he want to be a professor? Did he want to go work in Washington? And Bill said, go to Washington for a year. And he did, and today he's a very successful professor. Oh, I'm over. Okay, I'm going very fast now. The value of specialists, great teachers here. So when I started grad school, I was deciding whether to specialize in Russia, the Middle East, China, and that was all because of great teachers, Zvi Gittleman, Mike Oxenberg, Jerry Green, among others. And last, of course, one of the tools in my box that I use to do research is survey research. How could you not be a great survey researcher? So coming from the first project I worked on at the lab where we interviewed 600 Russian field grade officers to a project I'm doing in Iraq right now, and in between, learn how to do good survey research. And I am way over, so I'm going to thank you.
I just want to thank you all. I'm very honored to be included in this panel. It doesn't feel like very long ago that I was here as an undergraduate, partly because it wasn't very long ago that I was here as an undergraduate. I'm just going to give you a little bit about my background, and then I'm going to reflect upon one major theme about how my political science degree has informed my career trajectory. That said, I'm very young in my career trajectory, so you'll all have to bear with me. Hopefully I can provide some reflections that'll be useful for some of you students who are in a position that I was in not very long ago. So as was stated, I graduated in 2008 with a degree in political science and economics. And I participated in many activities on campus, but I think that one of the most memorable was the Michigan and Washington program. And it's already been stated by our keynote speaker, but that program is phenomenal. And I was in the second group to go, and it was a group of about 20 students who went to Washington, D.C. for a semester during the academic year and had an internship. Many of us worked on the Hill, some of us did jobs related to anthropology or the sciences. And my job was working at the House Judiciary Committee. And at the same time, we took classes with Michigan faculty. And this was an amazing opportunity to get to know Michigan faculty and to get a taste of Washington, D.C. After I graduated from the University of Michigan, I went on to Yale Law School, and I'm in my final year at Yale Law School. And there I've also participated in many amazing activities, but I wanted to just highlight a few of my experiences at Yale Law School. The first is I spent my first summer in Nigeria. I was working at the Social and Economic Rights Action Center, which is a local Nigerian-based NGO. And that experience was a very mixed bag. And I say that because on the positive side of things, for a person like myself who's very interested in resource oil exploitation in Africa, I think that you can't really understand those issues without visiting the Niger Delta. And I was fortunate enough to be able to travel to Port Harcourt and visit the Delta and see the kind of issues that the people there are facing and the kind of hardship and life in the face of extreme poverty and the economic degradation that's been occurring there and the violence. It was a mixed bag, though, because they were worried that I would be kidnapped in Port Harcourt because I'm a foreigner in Nigeria, and the mixed bag part of it is that I was actually grabbed into an unmarked van in Lagos and sort of taken hostage for about a half an hour, but I was fine, fortunately. That's kind of comes with the territory of Nigeria. So my interest in sort of international economic development continued, and I became very interested in the Chad-Cameroon oil pipeline. I started studying this major resource investment in Africa, and the World Bank's role in trying to coordinate the project so that the money that would be given to the Chadian government wouldn't go to corruption. And eventually I realized that in order to understand that issue, you also had to go to Chad. So I went to Chad in my second year of law school, and fortunately Yale funded me for that, and sort of tried to figure out what was going on. And I have a research paper that's going to be published in the Yale Journal of International Law that speaks to some of those issues. And then last summer I was working at a law firm, which my family appreciated because it meant that I wasn't off traveling to very dangerous places. I will be returning to that law firm, Hughes, Hubbard & Reed, after graduation. So when I was thinking about how my political science degree had informed sort of my very young career trajectory, I thought about sort of one thing that really stuck with me. And that was that coming from the University of Michigan to a place like Yale, I consistently hear people say, oh, you came from a very large university, or University of Michigan is such a huge place. And I think that the one thing that I want to tell you all is that I never realized that I was at a very big university when I was here. And I think that there are two takeaways from that. And the first is that I never felt like I was overwhelmed in a giant university because people in the political science department were very approachable. And I knew the staff members in the political science department because I would frequently have meetings with them. And I would ask them questions. I would ask them about what classes I should take. I went and knocked on doors of professors, even though I had no idea what I was doing, and they were receptive to it, including Professor Zimmerman, when I asked him if I could do research for him, and he asked me if I spoke Russian, and I said no, and then he asked me if I could do statistical analysis, and I said, I think I can do that. So the point is that the professors here are extremely approachable. The staff is approachable. They have programs like Michigan and Washington, which are designed to make the big university a very small place. The second point that I want to make about the fact that I never realized I was at such a big university is that I kind of took it for granted that this is a huge place, and the opportunities that exist in a place like the University of Michigan and in a department like the political science department are immense. And I really encourage you as students to take advantage of that. I came into the program thinking that I wanted to study domestic US politics, and I came out being convinced that I wanted to go into international economic development. And I could do that at a place like this because the political science department is not dominated by one or two big personalities. It's very robust. It has a great political theory, domestic US politics, international politics. And so whatever kind of niche you want to find, you can do it at a place like the University of Michigan. And, as undergraduates particularly, you are probably not going to come in knowing exactly what you want to do, and that's okay. And what's great about the University of Michigan is that you can experiment and find your niche, and it provides those opportunities. Thank you.
Ambassador Levitsky.
Well, first of all, let me say that thank you very much for inviting me. What a great honor it is for me to be on a panel with people who have contributed so much to the country and will contribute even more to the country, if we think about our last speaker in particular. So when I was asked by Bill Zimmerman to talk about how political science helped advance my career, first thing I thought, being a rather puckish person, was, well, that's going to be a short speech. But I started thinking about this, and really, in a sense, I owe just about everything that I was able to accomplish to this great university and to the Department of Political Science. And I started thinking about those professors that I hadn't thought had affected me, but in fact did. This was a really terrific department at the time. 1956 to 1960 was when I was a student here. And we had on the faculty, for example, James Pollock, who taught German affairs, U.S.-German relations, who had actually been involved in as a senior advisor to the government and helped to draft some of the seminal documents that made up the German Constitution. Bill Bayless, who got me interested in Soviet affairs and Russian affairs. I took Russian here. And two particular professors that had a lasting effect on me during my career. One, Frank Grace. Frank Grace taught political theory and political thought. And while that might not appear that would have an effect on a career in government in the Foreign Service as a diplomat, I remember very well just the idea of organizing your thoughts around particular issues, structuring how you looked at questions that would confront you when you were dealing with policy matters. And I remember very well one of the first papers I wrote had to do with the U.S. national interest. It's something that has always been at the forefront of our policy. After all, we're trying to, in the Foreign Service and the government, trying to promote U.S. national interests. The other professor was Innes Claude, who wrote a seminal book on the UN organization, international organizations, called Swords into Plowshares. Got me interested in multilateral affairs. And I remember having the pleasure when I was a junior officer in Frankfurt am Main in Germany. Innes was sent out by the U.S. Information Agency, which existed at the time, come out and make some speeches in Germany. Remember, this is in the early 1960s, not that far after the war. And I was able and felt honored to actually host him and introduce him at the various speeches that he made in our area. So there were some direct connections. One skill that I learned here that had a direct effect on my career was cramming. The good sense of cramming. Taking things that you didn't know much about because you hadn't studied enough during the semester, learning about them, understanding what was embedded in them, what were the important things. I just mentioned two incidents where this technique of trying to understand subject matter was important to me. The first one, 2 years, 1978, 1979, December. So I'm Jewish, and I was the head of an office of UN political affairs. I used to let the non-Jewish members of my staff, which was most of the staff, take the holidays off, and I would man I'd go take off Rosh Hashanah, and they would take off the Christmas holidays. 2 times, 1978, 1979, we had major incidents in the world. 78 was the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, and we had to write a speech for our representative in the UN Security Council during an emergency meeting to give. 1979, same thing, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Once again, emergency meeting of the Security Council. In both cases, I think, as I look at it in retrospect, some of the things I learned about how to get into issues, and I knew obviously something about those 2 issues, but I was not the expert. The expert in my staff was gone. In both cases, I had to write the first draft of the speech. And as I was thinking back of the experience, this skill of being able to understand the currents of world affairs, the dynamics that go into an issue, and the interests that are involved from the United States, in both cases were a terrific benefit to me. So those were at least some of the contributions, but just about everything I did. Our speaker, keynote speaker, said, he was jack of all trades, master of none. I've felt that way myself. Actually, it's benefited me here at the Ford School, since I teach courses in U.S. national security and a course in drugs, crime, and terrorism, both of which have worldwide implications. I want to finish up with one particular story that has a direct relationship to both today and tomorrow's game. 1974, Vladivostok, Russia. Gerald Ford, played football here, is coming to Vladivostok to negotiate the final elements of the SALT II treaty with Henry Kissinger. Donald Rumsfeld, remember, was Secretary of Defense in that little window of time as well. And so I was at Embassy Moscow, and I headed the middle grade Foreign Service officer, headed the team that went out to prepare for this visit, 2 weeks in Vladivostok, which was a closed city at the time. Americans hadn't visited there since about 1949. So we went out with a White House team, and we spent 2 weeks in Vladivostok preparing for the trip. You know, the joke is 2 weeks, second prize was 3 weeks. But in any case, we finished this exhaustive 2 weeks, and our Air Force One and our plane take us back to Moscow was in Khabarovsk, which is about 120 miles away north of Vladivostok. And President Brezhnev at the time gave President Ford, his train, his personal train, to take him back up to Air Force One. And all of us went up on that train. And we were exhausted, and I was sitting up in the front of the train. All the big wigs were in the back, and I was in the front. I was kind of dozing, but I had this little bud in my ear from the White House, the security people. And I hear on my ear, Levitsky, come up to the dining car. Pasky wants to see. Pasky was the code word for President Ford. And I thought, oh yeah, sure. Kidding me, I went back to sleep. And I said, Levitsky, come on. So I said, well, I better do this because otherwise I'm not going to get any sleep anyway. So I go up to the front and I walk up there in a half daze and I open the door, and out there, standing up in front, a few yards away, is President Ford, and somebody whispers in his ear, and he comes up to me with that big stride that he had. He was a big guy after all. And I thought, oh boy, he's going to thank me for all my work and everything. Puts his hand into mine. He says, you're a fellow U of M graduate, right? He said, yeah. He said, you know, we lost to Ohio State last night. So I now have a picture in my office which says I'm standing by President Ford, and the caption is, to Mel Levitsky, a fellow alumnus who suffered our defeat in Vladivostok, 1974.
That's awesome.
So
That's very cool.
thank you very much.
Our next speaker will be Ms. Pollock.
Well, I don't have a better story than that, but I do have a presidential story. This department is 100 years old, and my tenure here was at the midpoint. It was 50 years ago. And about a month after I started classes, one evening, I was out in front of the Union waiting for candidate Jack Kennedy to come by and to give what would become a very famous speech, asking our generation to look beyond ourselves and to serve in something called the Peace Corps. It was 1960. In 1960, women lived up in the hill. There were steely-jawed old women with stopwatches that clicked at 11 o'clock. If you were a minute late, I never knew what would happen to me because I was too terrified to find out. What did I do when it was the word on the street was, well, it's just another half hour. Well, it's just another half hour, and it got later and it got later. It was 1960. I did what I was supposed to do. I went home to the dorm and missed the speech. I did get up the next morning, and I was on the steps out in front, and like Colin Gray said this morning, I didn't wait for an introduction. I put my hand out, and I talked to Jack Kennedy, but I did miss that speech. And I say this story because it's of interest to me, but also because it's indicative of, it's emblematic of the day and the time in which I went I was an undergraduate. I was a girl. And there were very few women, girls, with the vision that Professor Saxonhouse had to go on and get to really become a professional political scientist. I didn't have that vision, but I had a passion for politics. And I went on and I've done a lot of politics. I love it. I love the manipulation of power for the purposes of good, a good outcome. And it was shaped very much, I was shaped very much and influenced also by professors here. So while I had a little encouragement, actually, I have to say, to go on to do a public administration graduate degree. So it wasn't as if, as a female, they discouraged me. There was even some little encouragement towards a career. But mainly what I got here is a chance to become enthralled and excited and stimulated and challenged. And I remember the first class I sat in, 101. It was in the Nat Sci building, and it was co-taught by Frank Grace and Roy, I believe, Pierce, Professor Pierce. And those two men changed my life. I as great teachers will. They made sense out of something that I didn't even have a name. I didn't even know how to name, which was political theory or theories of power. And years later, not too many years later, in my senior year, and there was a little break there for marriage and children in between, but a few years later, I had a course from Frank Grace, another course, and it was his political theory course, 2 semesters, and it was great. But the main thing I recall is one series of conversations in class. It was 1968. It was Vietnam. And Frank Grace was a very conservative guy. And Frank Grace very much supported the war and told us why he supported the war and why we needed to be there and why our interests, the United States interests, had to be defended this way. But he encouraged the students to challenge him. And challenge him they did. And it was the intellectual challenge, the challenge that was fine to go between professor and student, that made it all right. It was the best of an American university classroom, and a best of, I think, a university education in the late 60s. And I am very grateful for having been a part of it. And I am very grateful today for having had the opportunity to come back and do this little trip down memory lane. Thank you.
Mr. Schuster.
It is an honor to be with these panelists and to speak to all of you. Mel just reminded me of a story that I'd been thinking a lot about the Department of Political Science and the experience as an undergrad, and one of the things that I remember loving about it was that while the studies were highbrow, sometimes what we would examine in terms of trying to understand events around the world or governments or politics was lowbrow. And Mel, you reminded me of a story that 13 years ago, I was covering the White House, and the news organization I was working for, we were the pool, so we were into the Oval Office for events when there's not a lot of room for a lot of the press corps. And President Clinton had played golf that day, and all of us who were in the pool had gone out to Andrews Air Force Base, wherever the golf course was, watched him play watched him play golf with his brother, came back. And then there was an event in the Oval Office where he signed something, and then he stuck around. And some of us in the press corps were able to talk to the president for a few minutes. And we just had some sort of random conversation about his brother's golf game and how things were going. A year and a half later, when the Star Report comes out, I come to find out that that very afternoon, he had not only done an event in the Oval Office in front of the press, he had not only played golf, but he had had about 25 minutes with Monica Lewinsky. But anyway. I want to, Bill Zimmerman had asked that we try to, I think that we try to make this as interesting and provocative as possible. And I want to give credit to Colin for just blowing us all away with the presentation earlier this morning. It was really terrific. One of the things that I just loved about political science, and I have to admit it was not my first choice when I came to Michigan. I thought I would be an English major, then I thought I would be a business major, then I thought I would be a statistics major, and after doing miserably in most of those subjects, I came upon political science, and I was so drawn by the enthusiasm and the curiosity that the department fostered in all of us. And it fostered, in part, and backed up my own sort of enthusiasm that I think I had had as a fairly precocious teenager in terms of being interested in politics and world events. So political science continues to sort of foster this curiosity around the world, and I end up getting into the world of journalism because of some time spent in Washington. And along the way, through journalism, I'm able to cover things like politics, election recounts, the election of Bill Clinton, the election of Barack Obama, scandals, whether it was the Whitewater investigation or Monica Lewinsky or the Starr Report, wars, war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, and also natural disasters, including Hurricane Katrina. The profession has taken me all over the world, whether it's Baghdad or Doha, Qatar, or Amman, Jordan, or Saudi Arabia, or Biloxi, Mississippi. But one of the things that there's always been some sort of tension between journalism and what was so ingrained in me as a political scientist here at Michigan is that in journalism we tend to, perhaps because of the parameters of journalism, simplify everything. Everything gets sort of reduced to the sound bites, as Colin was talking about earlier, or the very simplistic explanations. And what was so important to me in terms of the political science grounding was an understanding that the world is far more complex. It's far more nuanced than you will see on the evening news or than you might read in your newspaper. And to the extent that I could as a journalist, I felt, you know what? I'm going to take some of that grounding that I had in political science and try to be the best informer of news consumers, not by going for the simplistic explanation, but by trying to understand all of the various causes, all of the factors at play. Political science, as you know, is not just about how we try to understand the world, but sometimes how about the world tries to understand our government and our systems. And one of the stories that I was right in the middle of and was so struck by how the world viewed it was Hurricane Katrina. And the reason I bring this up is in journalism, there tends to be an explanation of events that they're personality driven. So for example, I was assigned to Biloxi, Mississippi at the last minute because some of the weather maps suggested that Hurricane Katrina might jog a little bit east of New Orleans, and NBC and MSNBC needed somebody in Biloxi. I get to Biloxi, and it's a direct hit. The surge is 25 feet. It hits the poorest part of Biloxi, Mississippi. Hundreds of people are killed, and the question that so many people were asking is, those people, they must have just been stubborn, that they didn't want to leave, they didn't think it would hit. I had thought to myself, okay, maybe there's an institutional reason as to why people couldn't leave Biloxi, Mississippi. I mean, political scientists, you learn there are all sorts of factors that contribute. And sure enough, we found somebody who sold, who rented furniture to lower and middle-class people and very poor people in this portion of Biloxi, Mississippi, who told us a harrowing story, literally as helicopters are flying over this part of Mississippi where they're still doing rescues of people who have water up to the roof. And he describes how in the days leading up to Katrina, a number of people came to his store and said, hey, Joe, can you give me $20 or $30? My government checks aren't going to come for a few more days. I'm afraid that, I don't have the money. I can't fill up my car with a tank of gas to get out. These were people who wanted to leave. They wanted to get out of there. They just didn't have the funds. And it became clear that the institutional problem of people being dependent on checks only coming from the government at a certain time, in this case, cost hundreds of people their lives. The point I mention this, the reason I mention this is, again, because of political science, because of the grounding that there's so many factors at play in trying to understand our world, that there's so many consequences that we don't necessarily see, that in my view it certainly helps my own personal effort to try to be a better journalist, but also to try to inform the people who are consuming the news. And I guarantee you that as somebody who was so steeped in sort of political science and still love it so much that when the day comes when somebody says, Schuster, get in the chair, something has happened over Detroit, it looks like somebody may have just tried to bomb an airliner, you're on in 30 seconds, go. You use every bit of political science, research, experience, understanding that you were taught at Michigan and that your life has accumulated along the way. Likewise, if the time comes when a producer says into my ear, we just have gotten some word that Israeli warplanes have bombed nuclear reactors in Iran, go. It's a nightmare scenario for so many governments and people around the world. Our responsibility, both as political scientists and how we use political science, is to be able to inform and explain in a way that not necessarily calms people's fears, but gives them an explanation. The best explanation sometimes when we don't have complete information, but by being curious, by being enthusiastic about the process, I think we validate what so many of us were taught here at the University of Michigan. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I think all of our panelists had wonderfully informative things to say, and I don't know, having moderated many panels like this, I actually have to say, astonishingly, all of them hewed to their allotted time, so we actually do have some time left for questions. Is there anyone that would, I know it's always difficult to be the first one in class to stand up, so I'm prepared to call on you if no one's willing to step up for a question for our panelists here.
So I'm a political activist. I try and be scientific about it. But I notice in demonstrations, the political science department and students from political science are not really present in social activism, in demonstrations in the street about the war, about the climate, about multiple other questions. What would you say to students now about the role of activism, public expression of dissent and alternative views that is necessary in the situation that we deal with now?
That's a wonderful question, thank you. Which would like to start off with that?
Well, it's a free country, so you can be an activist or not be an activist and still be an active participant in political life. But I would say one thing, in my career in the government, where often the government fears political activism, I can name a dozen instances in which political activism, in what I think is the good sense of pressing forward causes like human rights that governments sometimes tend to ignore, have had an effect on policy, that have caused government officials like myself and others who have been in jobs in which they're responsible for carrying out policy, have had to both think twice, and then because of the pressure generated by that kind of activism through the Congress and through other kind of channels, the press and otherwise, have had to change the way we do things. Perhaps not to the extent that the activists want, but in fact that's what the country's all about, which is we move it a little bit this way, we have pressures that way, you can get your way, the most active people generally, whether you call them lobbyists or human rights organizations or whatever they are, generally can have an effect on policy, and I think that's what's great about this country.
I would love to add to that, actually. Sorry. I would just like to push back on that a little bit. As a recent political science graduate, I saw my my fellow political science students engage in a lot of activism. I was engaged in activism with Amnesty International, and I started Walmart Watch on campus, and a lot of the students that I worked with were very engaged in various forms of activism. I think that as students sort of navigate this process, they always have to choose and make difficult decisions about where they can best use their talents, and whether that's working within the system or pushing back on the system. And that's something that everyone struggles with, but I think that, I guess I would just say that I do think that activism in this department is alive and well.
I think it's a really interesting question that I'm wondering if there's some thesis or some research in this. I'm really curious, what allows a person to step up and step out and really challenge authority? And what holds similar-minded people back, but they don't feel comfortable on the street, so to speak? And the psychology of that is something that I don't have any insights into. I do know that for me, I've moved, in spite of the job I have now, which precludes me from, I'm now a diplomat for the first time this old age, and I have a virgin diplomatic passport, Mel, not like you, which has a lot of action in the passport, only the passport. Excuse me. But it took me, in the 60s, I was interested, but I hung back. I got to the 80s, or the 90s, I guess it was the 90s, way into my adult professional political life, and decided that I was embarrassed that I had never been arrested. And so, and I'm glad Bob King is here to hear this, I got arrested in a labor demonstration in the 90s, in part because I believed in the cause. I did believe in the cause. In part, it was who asked me, and that gave me courage. I was going to be with people I knew and trusted and looked up to, and that might be part of it, is who's out there, are your peers out there. And in part, I was just embarrassed that I'd never been arrested for a good cause in the 60s, and I had to fix that.
And you still got a passport.
And I still have a passport and a security clearance, but I told them about it.
So not so much a question, but just informing you. There is research going on here looking into the causes of or promoting student activism on campus. I'm actually a student researcher under doctoral student Cassie Barnhart in the School of Education, looking at different factors across universities that, whether there's a graduate student union or whether there are classes that promote area studies that contribute to more student activism. So just thought I'd let you know. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Can I just make one quick point? I think that in some way the traditional model, the traditional understanding of activism may be outdated. We live in this great age where right now you could be an activist with a couple clicks. 30 seconds, you firing off an email to your member of Congress or the journalist you don't like, or bringing attention, or you join a Facebook group, and suddenly you're within a community that would have taken days, weeks, or months in the past. And I think that's a great opportunity for younger people now that maybe people of your generation didn't have, is that technology, in a way, has, if you only have time because of life responsibilities to be an activist for a couple of minutes a day, there's still something valuable you can do. And I think younger people tend to understand that better than a lot of us.
As the contrarian, who I make my living as a political scientist, basically professionally poking needles into other people's balloons. There was a great column a couple of days ago about this notion of activism, and they made the point that there's a big difference between clicking "I agree" on Twitter or Facebook and getting in a march down into Biloxi, Mississippi. We had another question, and that's not meant in a snide way,
Okay.
but that probably came off that. But there is, I think, something has changed.
Makes it too easy sometimes.
I think that there's something different today about mass movements on the internet versus mass movements where you actually have to show up, be counted, and in fact put yourself at risk of being arrested.
Although it is alive in some parts of the world too, because you look at the in Iran, the Green Movement in Iran, they used technology, and I think they used it to their advantage, but they also put their lives on the line too, and we're out there. So I think the two can work together.
There's someone in the back there, yes, in the green.
Michigan State color.
Wondering about your thoughts and experiences with foreign aid, and if you found it beneficial to the receiving countries.
As a what? I did.
Foreign aid.
Foreign aid, if it's beneficial to the receiving
Beneficial.
countries.
Yeah, to receive.
Well, I could say something. I think it's a mixed picture, really. Part of the problem is the system under which we work and the evaluation of what contributes. Since the way the Congress looks at the effectiveness of foreign aid tends to be very short range, so that there's pressure on the bureaucrats who administer foreign aid programs, let's say in Africa, development in development situations, developing countries, to produce fast results. And there's very little patience in the country in general with something that takes years and years. So that there's a premium on building, let's say, building roads rather than training teachers, which has a longer range effect. And so that tends, I think, to detract from the ability for the United States to have a long-range impact on developmental questions, which require things like better teachers, higher standards of ethics in government, anti-corruption programs, that kind of thing. So I think it's a mixed picture. Our aid has helped in many cases. If you think about what we, even during the last Bush administration, which wasn't an administration, after all, noted for its humanitarian impulses, the money that was devoted to doing HIV/AIDS work in Africa actually has shown quite a large and important short-range effect. So I say it's, there are various judgments on this. There's a recent study out that apparently says that the new Millennium Challenge Corporation, which works with countries that can meet certain standards of good governance, has been much more effective than the U.S. aid put out by the U.S. Agency for International Development.
If I could give you an anecdote that may help make the point, and I think the point is that sometimes there's so much of a focus on the foreign aid, there's not the same sort of energy or enthusiasm to put a focus on the institutions that can take in that aid and distribute it. And the anecdote is, when I was in Baghdad 2 years into the war, NBC's position for the elections was in the middle of the green zone, and literally a block away there must have been 300 brand new white SUV vehicles that were eventually, I suppose, going to be going to the Iraqi police. The problem was, while the United States and other governments had done a great job of getting this equipment in there, they hadn't thought through, well, how's it going to be distributed? What are the institutions that are going to be able to take this aid and put it to good use? And I think that's sometimes the mistake that tends to get made. There's such a focus on, is foreign aid helpful or not, and there's not enough focus on, okay, what can we do to build up the institutions internally to make it helpful?
I agree. Sorry. I agree with everything that's been said already. I would just add that I also think that sometimes the foreign aid debate actually sort of distracts us from the bigger issues, and that is how other policies of the U.S. Actually have an impact on developing countries, and those policies are our food subsidies or our trade policies and the actions of the World Bank and the IMF. And I think that if you actually want to solve problems like global poverty, obviously, yes, feeding people is extremely beneficial, but given all of the issues that come with getting food on the ground, it's not any sort of long-term solution to that problem. And a lot of times we have policies in place that are actually sort of contributing to the underlying causes of global hunger. And therefore, when you talk about things like aid, it's sometimes just distracting from the bigger problems of U.S. policy.
Well, thank you very much.
I got out in '58 as an undergrad here, and then did the master's degree. And in those days, I can't speak today, but 50-some years ago, it was an awful lot of work. And in fact, in my situation, I did not receive the master's degree in '59, but rather after I entered the Air Force, it was in 1960 that I went over to the stadium for my degree. But I would simply say this, that this, in my thinking, I think there were maybe 2 Republican faculty members. All the rest were Democrats. And this disappointed me. It wouldn't disappoint me today, however. But let me say this, that we had 24 students in the master's program back there in '58 and '59. And I can't tell you what a wonderful group they were, and I wish I could remember their names. I've got them someplace at home. But I'll tell you, it was an outstanding experience for me, and I think for those who also took the degree. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on that celebratory note, I think we've reached the end of our time. We have a few minutes for a coffee break, and then we'll begin again in about 10 minutes with our panel on state politics. Thank you all for coming.